Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, depending on where you sit. My name is Kelly Kramer, and I'm a partner in our Washington, D.C. office. I'm also the co-chair of Mayor Brown's White Collar Defense and Compliance Practice Group. With me today as co-presenters, or probably more accurate, is actually the stars of the show today, are Salim Saud, Paula Magalhaes, and Adriana Diaz. Adriana is speaking in place of Leonardo Morato. Salim, Paula, and Adriana are all partners at Tawil & Checker in Brazil. Salim, who is based in Rio de Janeiro, is a member of the corporate and M&A practices, and he's a leading expert on Brazil's Clean Companies Act, and he's involved in monitoring the Petrobras investigation very closely, and he's got a lot of insights to share about that today. Paula is a partner in the Sao Paulo office of Tawil & Checker. She's a member of the corporate and M&A and capital markets practice and has extensive experience representing clients before the CVM, which is Brazil's securities regulator. Adriana is also a partner in the Sao Paulo office of Tawil & Checker, and she focuses her practice on insolvency matters, which, as you'll hear, is an incredibly active area right now in Brazil. Before we begin, before I turn it over to Brazil, I have a few housekeeping announcements. First, as we go along, we hope that you ask questions. It'll make it much more interesting for everyone. You can do so using the Q&A panel on the right side of your screen, and we'll make every effort to answer your questions either as we go or towards the end of the webinar. If we don't get to it, we will follow up with you directly by email after the presentation is finished. Second, that we do offer CLE credit for this presentation. At some point in the middle, we'll be providing an alphanumeric code. In order to receive CLE credit, participants must record this code on the virtual sign-in sheet that was emailed to you with the log-on instructions for today's programs. Finally, I've got one caveat. The views that Salim, Adriana, and Paula and I express today are our own and should not be attributed to our firm or our clients. And so with that, let's get started. I'll turn it over to Salim.
Thank you, Kelly, and good morning and good afternoon, everyone. So I'll give a little bit of an update on the car wash operation, and a number of you have probably dialed in previous webinars. So this is we'll try to focus only on the new developments. As you all know, it all started in 2009. It was initially an operation focusing on illegal money brokers, and then it was expanded to investigate allegations of corruption at Petrobras. The name car wash has stuck, and the name has to do with the practice of using gas stations for money laundering by these illegal brokers. But then several different phases of the operation have received their own names. Dolce Vita, Doomsday, Bidon, My Way. Nonetheless, car wash has stuck, and that's how most people know what's currently going on in Brazil. Even though it started in 2009, last year was when the corruption of Petrobras became public. And between March and October, a Petrobras executive and a black market money dealer entered into plea agreements with the Brazilian authorities, and they began cooperating, providing information on the corruption scheme going on at Petrobras, or allegedly going on at Petrobras. And at the same time, that was already in November 2014, SPM Offshore, which is a Dutch supplier of offshore oil vessels, they settled a bribery case with the Dutch authorities involving $240 million in payments to Petrobras employees. So by then, there was already a public acknowledgement that there was corruption going on at Petrobras. And as a result, the Petrobras' auditor has refused to sign off on the third quarter financials. When this happened, the whole operation became like a popular Brazilian soap opera. As you know, Brazilians like soap operas. They rush to their houses every night to see the next chapter of what's going on TV. And that happened with the car wash operation. And pretty much every week there would be a new development, and everyone was looking at the news, not at the soap opera bracket at the television, but everyone was looking at the news to learn what was the new development in the operation. In November, there was a massive operation called Operation Doomsday, in which 45 individuals got arrested for questioning. Some got arrested and were kept in prison for a while. There were several down raids as well. Between November and January, a number of developments occurred at the Congress, with a Congressional Investigations Committee issuing a report acknowledging some corruption, but also approving some of the actions by the board of Petrobras. In January, a former director of Petrobras International Division was arrested, and in February, another operation called Operation My Way was launched, with another a number of arrests, including a former Petrobras officer. The operation was called My Way, and that's an interesting story, after a Frank Sinatra song, because the director that got arrested, he had blue eyes. So the federal police, they have a very good sense of humor in naming the operations, and they thought it was funny to name it after Frank Sinatra. On March 3rd, the Brazil Attorney General has filed investigations requests before the Supreme Court against sitting politicians, and that includes the indictment of the presidents of Congress, which is the President of the Senate, and also the President of the House of Representatives. This was done because certain Brazilian politicians has what is called a prerogative of venue, and that means that they are entitled to be investigated or judged by the superior courts. So in case of sitting members of Congress and ministers, they should be investigated or judged by the Supreme Court. If we're talking about governors of state, they should be investigated or judged by the Superior Court of Justice, which is one of the Brazilian superior courts sitting in Brasilia. And that's what happened in March 13. A few days later, the governors of the state of Rio de Janeiro and Acre were indicted, and also the former governor of the state of Rio de Janeiro was indicted. Here you can see some pictures of Petrobras' officers being arrested. That has a little bit to do with the Brazilian interest in soap operas. Everyone would go to their houses and turn on the news to see what was going on and what was the newest development. In March, there was another chapter, let's call it like this, of the soap opera. And the federal police launched what they called Operation What Kind of Country Is This? Which in Portuguese is Que País É Esse? That's also the name of a very famous song that deals with corruption. Very famous song from the 80s. But it was named after a sentence that one of the officers said the first time that he was arrested. The first time that he was arrested, he was calling his lawyer and said, well, I can't believe what kind of country this is. I'm being arrested. I did nothing. And then the police, he ended up being released by the Supreme Court under a writ of habeas corpus. But then the federal police arrested him again, and this time he couldn't get his writ of habeas corpus, and he was kept in prison for a while. At the end of March, new arrests, and that includes another president of a large construction company in Brazil, the president of Galvão Engenharia, which later filed for bankruptcy. And in April, then we have another turnout, another interesting development. And Mr. Vacari, which is the treasurer, was at the time the treasurer of PT, which is the president of the Republic, the party of the President of the Republic, he was arrested. And he's still kept in prison. In April on April 28th, the Supreme Court has sent the executives that were arrested since November 2014 to house arrest. They were not released from prison. They were merely sent to house arrest, and they were prevented from communicating with each other. Just recently, we have had confirmation that a down raid was performed at the offices of the President of the House of Deputies. He was indicted for involvement in the corruption scheme, and the Supreme Court has ordered or authorized a down raid at the House of Deputies, which is unprecedented in Brazilian history. Just recently, just yesterday, there has been more arrests. Four former members of Congress have been arrested, and that means that the investigation is still going on. That means that we'll still have many chapters in this popular soap opera. At the same time, there was a little bit of a development at the Supreme Court. Some of you might remember our last corruption scandal, which judged a practice by the former government of paying some sort of allowances to certain members of Congress so that they would continuously vote with the government. And that was judged by the full Supreme Court. All of the 11 ministers or 11 justices would vote and decide on the matters. So there was a change in the procedures of the Supreme Court, and they now have decided that criminal matters will be judged by a panel, what is known as the second panel of the court, that has 4 members. The 4 members were Justice Teori Zavascki, which is the reporter of the case, of the cases being investigated at the Supreme Court, Justice Celso de Mello, Justice Gilmar Mendes, and Justice Carmen Lucia. And the 5th seat was vacant because there is a vacant seat at the Supreme Court. And there was a fair amount of talk about who would be appointed to the seat, and this person will be ultimately responsible for judging the car wash operation. And the President of the Republic wasn't comfortable appointing someone, and to solve the issue, the court decided to relocate one of the justices from the first panel to the second panel, and this justice is Justice Dias Toffoli. Dias Toffoli was appointed by President Lula. He will become the future president of the panel. And he served as the attorney for the Labour Party, the party of President Dilma, before he was appointed to serve as the Minister of Justice, and then appointed to the Supreme Court. So this is the newest developments in this soap opera that this Operation Car Wash has become. At the same time, Petrobras was struggling with its financial statements. PwC, which is Petrobras' auditor, has refused to sign off on the third quarter reports back in November of last year. And in January, Petrobras tried to approve the reports with the sign-off or the approval of the auditor, but PwC has refused to do so, especially because there was a debate on the amount of the write-down for corruption. Back then, the numbers would vary between 4 billion Brazilian reais and 80 billion Brazilian reais. So there was a fair amount of dispute, and Petrobras ended up releasing the reports without the sign-off. They were unaudited, and there was that information leaked to the press, and as a result, the CEO and all of the other officers have resigned. there was a fair amount of discontentment by the government with the way that this matter was handled. A new board was appointed, and new members of the board have been appointed, a new CEO and new officers have been appointed, and just recently, on April 22nd, Petrobras has issued financial statements. It included a 2.1 billion Brazilian US dollars write-down for corruption, that's equivalent to 6.2 Brazilian reais, and a 14.8 billion impairment, that's equivalent to 44 Brazilian reais. After the issuance of the financial statements, Petrobras has vowed to seek reimbursements for the write-down for corruption. It has already indicated that it will sue the 5 largest construction companies in Brazil, which are involved in the investigations, and they will seek reimbursement. So this raises an issue on the responsibility of the board of Petrobras and the officers of Petrobras during all this period. And my colleague, Paula Magalhães, will be able to explain a little bit what we can expect from CVM, which is the Brazilian Securities and Exchange Commission, in connection with all that.
Hello, everyone. My name is Paula, and thank you, Salim, for introducing me. Just to give you an update about the reimbursement received in car wash operation, Petrobras released yesterday a material fact indicating that it has received 157 million reais from to recover reimbursement of the illegal payments from car wash. This is the last update that we have from the material fact of Petrobras. As Salim said, in all this scenario of delay in the release of the financials, corruption and improper payments, and scandals related to the most important public health company that we have in Brazil, what can we expect from the activities of the Brazilian Securities Commission in this case? To start, this only slide that I have, I believe that CVM has 3 main linked roles in Brazil. The first of them is the compromise that it has with the market efficiency and development, not only by stimulating permanent investment, but also with the regular expansion and functioning of the stock market. And obviously, to have this compromise, it has to protect investors and market against illegal acts of the management and controlling shareholders of the company, and obviously ensure that investors access the appropriate information and that we have the endless transparency of the public health companies in Brazil. And obviously, to give more effectiveness in this activity to protect investors, CVM has the power to punish through administrative investigation and proceedings all violations and breaches, mainly of the corporate law, the security law, and all the other CVM normative rules, regardless, of course, of civil and criminal responsibility. I think that it is important to point out here that CVM has not the responsibility to check and to punish according to the law of the Brazilian corruption law. Obviously, it has the power to investigate the violation to all fiduciary duties of the management and of the controlling shareholders that are linked to the corrupted behavior, but not exactly directly linked to corruption law. So, just to give you an overview of the supervision and sanction of violations of corporate law and security law that CVM regulates, the main applicable penalties are fines, that shall not exceed the larger of 100,000 reais, which corresponds to approximately $170,000, 50% of the regular transaction, or 3 times the improper economic advantage. This last one is commonly used in insider trading investigation. The other main penalty that we have is the suspension or temporary prohibition up to 20 years to act as manager, board, or audit committee member of public health companies or the same positions at entities of the distribution system in Brazil. CVM in December of last year informed the market that we have 6 investigations ongoing against the management of Petrobras. They are related to pricing policies, outcome of illegal payments and corruption, being 2 of them converted into punitive administrative proceedings. These punitive administrative proceedings are those that are subject to the fines I just described. In the last month, CVM announced a 3rd punitive administrative proceeding against the board members of Petrobras in violation of their duty of loyalty by approving in the Petrobras business plan impossible targets in connection with the price policy that was being conducted by them. So we have here the activity of CVM to punish the senior management of the company. We do not have any decision yet about all these administrative proceedings. We know that we can have the fines and we can also have the suspension or temporary prohibition of all these individuals to act in public health companies or in the other entities of the distribution system. And we obviously know that this delay in the release of financial statements would be probably the next one to be subject to a punitive administrative proceedings. But so far, we do not have any decision from the board of CVM about this proceeding.
So,
Kelly, I was going to pose a question about this, not about the Cilia Code, of course. I was going to ask you whether you think that the U.S. would also take any enforcement actions in connection with all that is going on in Brazil. What is your view on that?
Well, Salim, I think it's an important question, and I would say that this is a little bit of an unprecedented situation. Historically, the United States has been the dominant enforcer when it comes to international corruption cases. As probably everyone on the phone knows, the U.S. has brought a series of very significant FCPA cases alleging international bribery, and they've collected huge amounts of fines, and there's been a number of prison sentences as well. The U.S. for years, though, has been pushing foreign countries to start enforcing their own corruption laws, and this is an example where Brazil seems to be very active, and Brazil seems to be intent on putting people in jail and in getting significant financial recoveries from people who took advantage of the system down there. So the U.S. has been saying for some time now, and one of the quotes on the screen is from the Assistant Attorney General at a recent speech, that international cooperation is the new normal. And the question that this case poses is, okay, if it is the new normal, what does that really mean? What should we expect from the DOJ? My own view at this point is that the DOJ and the SEC are going to be involved in this case, but they're going to do everything in their power to try to let Brazil proceed directly. As a matter of policy and as a matter of practicality, DOJ wants foreign governments to enforce these laws independently, and it doesn't have the evidence or the ability to round up the witnesses the way that they do in Brazil. Now, this is a excellent opportunity in some ways for the U.S. to demonstrate that foreign countries can enforce their own anti-corruption laws. And that's in part because the U.S. and Brazil have historically a very deep relationship when it comes to law enforcement. There are very few countries that the U.S. would trust more to actually go forth and investigate in a case like this. Brazil is DOJ's most prolific MLAT customer. That is, Brazil makes more requests for assistance of the United States in tracing assets or in doing taking other steps to help them in criminal investigations than any other country. There are lawyers from the United States DOJ in Brazil regularly, both for training and for assisting them in investigations. So what we're going to see is extensive formal and informal cooperation between the two countries. And the one thing that I can be certain that the United States is doing and is likely doing right now is it's coordinating money tracing and asset forfeiture efforts. The United States several years ago announced an initiative now called the Kleptocracy Initiative. And the whole point of that initiative is to try to find money that is the product of corruption, the product of bribes, that has moved into or through the U.S. financial system, to seize that money and ultimately to forfeit that money and return it to the country from which it was stolen. And there's no doubt in my mind that the U.S. is actively engaged in doing that right now. Now, what does that mean in terms of what concrete steps are being taken right now at the U.S. DOJ and at the SEC? The first thing is that there's legal advice and practical support. There's discussion on a day-to-day basis now between the lawyers in Brazil who are leading the investigation and coordinating it at the Ministry of Justice, and lawyers in the United States DOJ who are involved in the Petrobras investigation here in the States. We know that there's also proactive assistance with discovery. The United States, if it's requested by Brazil, can subpoena documents and can conduct witness interviews, take statements under oath. And that's happening now in the United States. That process has already begun. And as I said before, the United States is tracing the money. Asset freezes, restraining orders, asset forfeitures, repatriation, all of that is a sort of an ordinary course level of cooperation, and it's something that's already happening now. So when you think about...
Pardon me, this is the conference operator. I pulled your line out of conference privately at your host's request to confirm the spelling of your first and last name and your company name, please. If your line is muted, could you please unmute? Or if you're on speakerphone, please pick up the handset. At this time, I hear no response. I'll be releasing your line.
The DOJ and the SEC, it faces potential FCPA liability. It faces potential securities fraud liability. Braskem recently made a self-disclosure in its filings here in the United States that it had made disclosures to the U.S., and a variety of other multinationals who have exposure to the DOJ are in all likelihood approaching the DOJ, self-disclosing issues as it relates to Petrobras, advising them about the scope of the investigations that they're undertaking, and trying to get some clearance, if you will, from DOJ as to what is expected of them, what the DOJ expects of them at this juncture in the case. So while I think that the Brazilians are going to take the lead in this and very much will be the most significant players, I think that the United States DOJ and to a lesser extent the SEC are also going to be very significant players in this. But the economic issues in Brazil are obviously much more important than they are in the United States, given how important Petrobras is to the Brazilian economy. And I want to pass it on to Adriana to talk more about that, because to me, the economic issues at this point are the most pressing. The criminal issues will resolve themselves in time, but the situation in Brazil is a much more significant and dire one than the long-term criminal implications are.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Kelly. First, I would like to make an observation. These are the economic consequences of the investigation in accordance with my view as an insolvency practitioner here in Brazil. So dealing with insolvency, we have been seeing the movements here in Brazil that this scandal has been creating in the economy. So this is the limited view that we have now. These have been busy days here in Brazil, as Kelly was saying. The first consequence that we had is that we had 24 companies involved in this scandal that were banned from having new agreements with Petrobras. And for many of those companies, especially the not so big companies, the middle-sized companies that were service providers to Petrobras, the existence of new agreements was essential for them to have cash flow to finance the existing contracts. So the first consequence we saw is that when you don't have new agreements, you don't have new investments from Petrobras, the suppliers start to default on existing agreements they had. Additionally, when they come to Petrobras for claims under the existing contracts, which is a pretty common procedure that they had, every time they had more costs and more time for an operation and anything that had changed from the original project, they had claims against Petrobras, and everyone was used that these claims were accepted all the time. But in the middle of those crises, no one at Petrobras wants to sign and to give more money to any supplier. So these claims stopped, they stopped to accept those claims. This led to the closing of some operational sites. So at this moment, many of the construction sites of Petrobras are closed. Machines, equipment are all there. We have some of equipment that would be used to build new sites. They are there losing their guarantees, and this loss at the end of the day will be borne by Petrobras. The mid-sized construction companies are suffering a lot with that because they don't have new cash flow. So the first thing they had to do when the operational site closes is to dismiss all the employees. And some of those sites are located in the small cities in Brazil that made a lot of investments to attract Petrobras and to attract these construction companies to their cities, that are now facing some small crises that everyone, most of the population in the city has lost their jobs. So we start to see some local crises in remote cities where these investments from Petrobras were really important. This is also something that generates more cost to Petrobras because in accordance to Brazilian labor laws, it's not my specialty, but Petrobras can be held liable for all the labor claims against these employees against the original supplier, because Petrobras benefited at the end of the day for the services provided of those employees. So at this moment, some important companies that were big enough and that anyone in Brazil 2 years ago never thought we would face any liquidity problem had filed for bankruptcy. We have the Shaheen Group, it used to be a construction company, and for the last 10 years, it started to provide services for oil and gas sector, and especially for Petrobras. OAS filed for bankruptcy too, Galvão Engenharia. Aluminium Engenharia, that's not a company that it was mentioned, the car wash operation, although it doesn't make part of the Bennett companies from contractor of Petrobras. And the Inepar Group that had filed prior to the scandal, but that the scandal has limited the chances of the company to recover because the main important agreements were with Petrobras and were terminated during the bankruptcy case. As a bankruptcy practitioner here in Brazil, we have some important discussions. Our law has been enacted 10 years ago, so was enacted 10 years ago, sorry. And we have now the opportunity to test our law and to see if it answers to this big restructure process. We have some issues to be decided about whether the Brazilian courts have jurisdictions over foreign companies, because both Shaheen and OAS try to include foreign companies in the bankruptcy cases. The cases are in the beginning, there is no organization plan approved, there is no further development, so this is something that we have to see how this will develop together with the criminal investigation. At this point, we have some other companies that are always in the news, and we have clients asking us about the likelihood of their filing for bankruptcy. You hear names as Camargo Correia, Odebrecht, Engevix. Engevix was supposed to file 1 or 2 months ago. Everyone said that we will file for bankruptcy, but it didn't, and I believe it has an agreement with the Brazilian government, so everyone's saying now that it's not going to file for bankruptcy. Camargo Correia, Odebrecht are big companies that have a lot of financial agreements with cross-default clauses. I think they can, any company can face this crisis without filing for bankruptcy, these are the companies. Obviously, I cannot bet on that because 2 years ago, no one would say that OAS would file for bankruptcy but the likelihood of those companies filing are not so great. We heard, prior to the release of the financial statements of Petrobras, we heard a lot of questions about whether Petrobras could file for bankruptcy, what would be the responsibilities of the Brazilian government. Now that Petrobras filed the financial agreement, there was no financial default, no payment default under the Petrobras financial agreement. So I think this issue has not been asked so much as it has been before. Just to let you know, Brazilian Petrobras, there is no actual, the Brazilian bankruptcy law is not applicable to Petrobras. There is no actual bankruptcy law applicable to Petrobras. So if it's the case that Petrobras has to file, probably a new law will be enacted. And as a first answer, the Brazilian government are at this moment responsible for all the debt of Petrobras as their main shareholder.
Adriana, it's Kelly. Can I interrupt you? Just ask a question about that because I've never entirely understood that. Is the Brazilian government technically on the hook for Petrobras's debt, or is it simply a shareholder?
Yes, it's actually on the hook. Paula can help me that, but the previous Brazilian corporate law indicated that Petrobras, the Brazilian government, and the legal entity, the governmental entity that owns a company, as the controlling shareholder, would be responsible for all the debt of this company. So every time you have a company held by the government, the governmental legal entity would be responsible for the whole debt. There was a change in law, and this position was withdrawn, but there was it wasn't replaced. And what we have nowadays is just the fact that a provision of our bankruptcy law that it doesn't apply to companies that are held by the government or controlled by the government.
Yeah, about that, let me just add a comment. Because whether Petrobras can file for bankruptcy or not as a matter of law is a matter of relevance, but there's also the political issue associated with it. And few people would think that the Brazilian government would allow Petrobras to actually go bankrupt. It will most likely, even if it would be possible to happen under the law, it is very unlikely that the government would do that, because Petrobras's debt is heavily associated with the sovereign debt. So people see Petrobras as a very significant instrumentality of the Brazilian government, and letting Petrobras even file for bankruptcy would be not a practical possibility.
Yes. So there is not a practical possibility. There is no provision under our law. So if there is a point that Petrobras files for a bankruptcy, we will be in a much worse situation. So the government will be the government, I think, feels responsible for the debt of Petrobras, regardless any of the applicable law. And as per applicable law, they would be responsible also for the debt. If you go through the offer memorandums for the Petrobras offerings in the U.S. market, you can see a lot of information on that. There is I haven't seen any categorical affirmation that Petrobras is responsible for, the government is responsible for all the debt, but there are some wording that this bears the credit risk of the Brazilian government. So, because we believe Petrobras will survive, obviously in a smaller size, and there will be some divestment, but Petrobras is suffering out of this crisis. Because the first question is, with all these companies being banished from being retained by Petrobras, who Petrobras will contract with? Who will take care of those sites that have been closed? and this construction that Petrobras needs for continue to develop its activities, there is no company that Petrobras can retain. It could be an important an opportunity for foreign investors to come to Brazil and to try to acquire those businesses and to act in the Brazilian construction market. But then Salim and Kelly can talk better than me about that. You have all the regulatory issues here at that, because you don't know the consequences for the legal entity of all these investigations. So you should expect some more losses to Petrobras. And this obviously brings some consequences to the economics in Brazil. The first I would mention is that this has been a wave effect in all the suppliers, to Petrobras suppliers. The oil and gas sector had suffered a lot from the X group filing bankruptcy cases and insolvent situation. These suppliers are now facing the default of many suppliers of Petrobras, so there will be a wave effect, and most of economists talk about a recession in Brazil next year, for this year. With the Brazilian companies lost stake in the international capital markets, Petrobras made a lot of offers in the U.S. market, and it could raise money really easily, and this is not the situation anymore. Other Brazilian companies lost place in the capital market, so our companies will have more difficult to get new money and to refinance their debt. The Brazilian company have been faced crisis in the ethanol sector and the power sector. So I think we are in a trustworthy crisis with the Brazilian companies, and this can make the crisis worse because you cannot get new money in a time that the U.S. market is going really well. And I think it's important to mention that the whole world is looking at this investigation. It's important that our authorities are able to show at least some results, that our courts here can get a great end to the bankruptcy cases that are in court. It's a chance to Brazil to demonstrate it can deal seriously with this crisis that demands a serious action of our government and from our courts. So I think the economic consequences of these investigations are just beginning. We can have like 3-4 years to talk about these economic consequences, but this is the situation at this moment. So with these comments, I pass the word to Kelly.
Thank you, Adriana. I have a couple of questions for all of you in Brazil, and any of you guys can pick up any of these. The first is sort of a criminal law enforcement kind of question, and I guess probably this is mostly to Salim. Salim, are the companies that are involved in this investigation, are they likely to face any sort of criminal charges? And if not, what would happen to companies that employed people who were making payments to Petrobras officials?
That's actually a very interesting question, because in Brazil, criminal liability of corporations is very limited. Unless you're talking about an environmental crime, corporations cannot be held criminally liable. The individuals that perpetrated the actions, they can be held criminally liable. The companies, however, they can face civil liability. And there's a question on whether or not the Brazilian Clean Companies Act will apply to this conduct being investigated. The Clean Companies Act was enacted in 2013 and came into effect in January 2014, and a number of the investigated conducts actually occurred prior to that. So the companies will likely not be able to be punished by this conduct under the Clean Companies Act. But the companies would still face liability under other relevant laws such as the public procurement laws, and that means that the companies can face some fines. They would be required to reimburse the losses suffered by the administration, and in addition to that, they can be prevented from entering into contracts with the public administration. So if this happens, and we're talking about companies that actually are heavily dependent on public contracts, that can actually cripple the companies and even kill them.
So even though the companies can't necessarily be criminally charged, the enforcement environment in Brazil is still pretty significant. I mean, you can essentially be bankrupted by the investigation of the punishment. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's fair. Not by the investigation, because technically the companies could not be banned from entering into contracts during the investigation phase. What Petrobras did was not banning the companies. What Petrobras did was a suspension from new contracts. So Petrobras decided not to invite these companies to certain bids. However, the currently existing contracts are still valid, and they could still collect under these contracts. If there is a final decision determining that these companies violated the public procurement law, then the current contracts would be terminated.
Okay, slightly different topic. We've gotten a couple of questions about securities law and whether or not Petrobras or any of the counterparties would have exposure under the securities law. And just very briefly, in the United States, like I said before, Petrobras is traded here. It has ADRs, and it therefore is subject to the jurisdiction of the SEC, and it has to file periodic statements, as I imagine it does in Brazil, and Paula can talk about that in a second. Petrobras has been sued already in the United States for securities fraud in private class actions, and the FCC can be looking at this as well. One of the trends that we've seen in security enforcement over the past couple of years is that when companies have bad outcomes, there typically have been private litigation filed very quickly, alleging that the company's financial disclosures were materially misleading because they did not adequately apprise investors about the risk of that bad outcome. So, for example, after the BP Deepwater Horizon accident, BP was sued saying that they failed adequately to disclose the sorts of risks that were inherent in or attended to deepwater drilling. So in this circumstance in the United States, I think Petrobras does have some exposure, even if it can't be a direct target under the FCPA. The theory would be potentially that it had not adequately disclosed or misdescribed either its anti-corruption policies or the values of the assets that it was purchasing, and that therefore the financial statements prior to the restatement were materially misleading. Paula, is there any sort of similar kind of exposure for Petrobras in Brazil and via the CVM?
Yeah, in Brazil, we have, I believe that the same rules and how to put in the balance sheet of the amounts regarding proper payments and corruption. I believe that CVM will probably punish the management of Petrobras for the omission of the information to investors, including financial statements, and the delay of the disclose of such financials. But the fines here in Brazil are very limited to the amounts that I already explained here, that is 500,000 reais or 3 times improper economic advantage. And this last one, it's a little bit more difficult to establish here because you don't know exactly who was the person, the individual that paid and received the amount and how much we are talking about. So I saw here in the Q&A a question regarding how much the fine can be applied to an individual here in Brazil from administrative standpoint here, from speaking about CVM. I believe that in the proceedings related to insider information, we have the hugest amount of fine here in Brazil. About the financials, the omissions related to financials or delays, I believe that the fine would be only the 500,000 reais, not much more than this.
So the potential exposure actually in the States may be higher than Brazil on a simple security theory. Salim, Adriana was talking about the bankruptcy and how long it was going to take for this process to play out, and said it would take several years. Is there any guess at this point as to how long the investigations are going to be lasting in Brazil before we sort of close out this Petrobras chapter?
Not really. Well, you actually made a very interesting addition to your question. You asked before we close the Petrobras chapter. The truth is, this investigation is becoming so massive that it's going beyond Petrobras. It started with something that was absolutely unrelated to Petrobras. Then it went into Petrobras, and we already know it's starting to look at the power sector. To tell the truth, there is no specific answer as to when the Petrobras chapter will be closed. It'll probably still take a few months, but then it will likely expand to other sectors of the economy as well. So we're going to see this soap opera last for a long time. It's going to be like the days of our lives.
Adriana, we've been hearing a lot from hedge funds and other companies that are pondering making investments in Brazil now, looking at potentially distressed assets. From a restructuring standpoint, can you give us sort of just a sense of the risks or the opportunities in the Brazilian market right now?
There are a lot of opportunities, especially for hedge funds that are willing to take risks in Brazil. Unfortunately, we cannot give a lot of legal certainty for new investors. This is one of the biggest complaints we have. It's difficult when you have talked to an American investment fund. They need how the court will interpret this and this and that, and you cannot give a certain answer. And sometimes you come to the courts in São Paulo, the courts in Rio, there is no position in the Supreme Court, so we cannot provide a lot of legal certainty. But there are some really successful investments, so if you are willing to take some risk, it's a great opportunity. Because as I was saying, we don't know the consequence of the investigation for the legal entity. We have a lot of uncertainties about succession and liability, especially with labor claims here in Brazil. Even if you are talking about buying an asset in a bankruptcy case, with some legal assurance that will be no succession, so there is a risk. We have creditors in Brazil here, especially the financial institutions. They are really, really conservative, and they don't want to take the risk of being held successor of those companies. So it's really hard to give to these companies in bankruptcy an equity debt exchange solution. So if there is an investor that is willing to take these risks and come to Brazil, there are a lot of opportunities. We have some foreign investors that has been successful. There are a lot of banks willing to sell their claims with a huge discount because they have been facing really huge defaults in companies they were not expecting, such as Shaheen and OES. So I think it's a really good moment to look at Brazil and to look at the opportunities, look at the cases, look at the claims. And obviously, Brazil was needing a lot of investment in infrastructure, and it still will continue to need. And it's a huge market, and we'll face some dark years, but obviously it will recover. We are a big country. I think it's a good time to come to Brazil. And obviously, you have to consult a Brazilian lawyer, and investigate deeply those risks and the risks the new investor is willing to take. But I think it's a good moment to come.
And Salim, a follow-up question on that, which really goes more towards the due diligence angle here. If you are interested in acquiring assets in Brazil right now, or acquiring a company in Brazil, what sort of due diligence seems to be appropriate for companies that, for example, had contracts with Petrobras?
Well, in addition to performing the regular due diligence that you would do in the purchase of any business in Brazil, you should be very cautious because of the corruption exposure. If a company is doing business with Petrobras, that should be a red flag just to start with. And since there is successful liability under the Brazilian Clean Companies Act, if the company perpetrated any conduct after the Clean Companies Act came into force, you might actually be buying a problem. You might actually be buying liability, and if that's happening, you ought to know right from the start, and that's why you should perform very thorough due diligence in connection with the Petrobras contracts.
So Salim, one technique in the United States, at least, that we've used in advising folks who are buying companies that might have some anti-corruption problems is to make disclosures, whether formally through the Halliburton process or informally, just to alert DOJ to the fact that someone has come onto the scene, has taken over a company, and is taking steps to mitigate any sort of problems. Is there any tradition of doing anything like that in Brazil? And if somebody who was acquiring a company wanted to make those sorts of disclosures, to whom or to what would you make them? And how would you try to coordinate that in Brazil?
Well, first of all, there's no tradition of doing that. The law is brand new, and there's very few. Even the enforcement of the Clean Companies Act has been is only initiating. So for sure, there's no tradition. But this is actually tricky because if you do this, if you do disclosure to the U.S. Authorities, you might actually be able to take some remedial measures and avoid liability. Whereas in Brazil, at least 1/3 of the fines will have to be applied. So when determining whether it makes sense for you to make a disclosure to the Brazilian authorities, you have to consider that you might have to pay a fine. But also, if you consider that you have to, especially if you're talking about an international company, if the purchaser considers the possibility of making a disclosure to the U.S. authority, and this disclosure is actually becomes public, then the Brazilian authorities might have enough evidence to go after the local entity. So this is very tricky, and you should look at on a case-by-case basis. But you should know that making a disclosure in Brazil will not avoid liability. You will only reduce your risk. Reduce your exposure, and the reduction can actually be significant, but it will not be 100%.
Well, I have actually a ton more questions, and there are several that we didn't get to, but I also see that we've hit 1 o'clock, and we committed to an hour. So as I mentioned before, if you submitted a question that wasn't answered, we'll follow up with you directly. If you have any questions about today's topic, you can please email them to Erica Weber at eweber, W-E-W-E-B-E-R, at mayorbrown.com, and your questions will be promptly forwarded to the speakers. Thank you, Salim, Adriana, Paula. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in today. Thanks so much for your participation. Have a great day, and we'll be in touch with everyone whose questions we couldn't answer.
Thank you very much.